Hey guys, tonight we're heading into the Middle Ages, a time when people saw things so bizarre that if you or I witnessed them today, we'd both immediately call the news, the priest, and maybe an ex just to apologise. You know. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Medieval villagers woke up every day expecting normal problems. A broken cartwheel, a spoiled batch of ale, or Gerald the town gossip spreading rumours again. What they did not expect was walking into the barn and discovering that the cow had decided to birth something so bizarre that even God would have said, "Alright, who messed with the settings?" Because once in a while, medieval cows produced calves that looked like they were created by a committee of drunk goblins. You'd get the classics. Two-headed calf staring in opposite directions like it was judging the entire village simultaneously. Or the calf with no face, just smooth, unsettling skin, like the medieval version of a horror movie jump scare. Sometimes the mouth ended up on top of the head, like the universe accidentally hit shuffle on the facial features. And since medieval villagers didn't know about genetics, mutations, or maybe this cow just had a rough night, they immediately jumped to the most logical conclusion. The heavens were angry. Unbelievably angry. Everyone went straight into prophecy mode. This is a sign. A warning. Definitely Margaret's fault. She said hello to a crow yesterday. Monks arrived in record time, ready to document the monstrosity like it was an exclusive interview. They'd sketch the poor creature with all the seriousness of Renaissance artists and label it with something dramatic like, "Year of our Lord, a beast of two heads was born, foretelling chaos." Meanwhile, the calf was just existing, confused and probably hungry. The villagers, meanwhile, debated what the creature meant. Half the village said it was a divine omen. The other half said it was a demonic warning. A few said, maybe it's just a weird cow. They were ignored immediately. As for what to do with the creature, opinions varied wildly. Some believed such animals brought blessings, so they kept them. Others thought they brought curses, so they buried them. Some, with confidence that can only be described as medieval audacity, suggested eating it. Meat is meat, they'd say, while everyone else quietly planned where to exile them. And don't forget the Lord. He always appeared eventually, wanting to see the strange animal himself. Not out of compassion, but because lords loved collecting weird stuff. If a calf was born looking like a mythological creature, he wanted it in his backyard immediately. For medieval villagers, strange animal births were more than biological accidents. They were events, drama, entertainment, the medieval version of trending news. Because when a cow gave birth to something unholy looking, the village didn't just observe it. They panicked, prayed, theorized, argued, blamed Margaret, and added it to the long list of things that prove life is out to get us. Imagine living in a time before electricity, before neon lights, before you could Google, "Is blue fire normal?" and calm yourself down with a scientific explanation. Now imagine walking outside during a storm and seeing the church steeple glowing bright blue, like it's about to cast a spell on the whole village. Welcome to St. Elmo's Fire, Medieval Edition. St. Elmo's Fire is just plasma caused by strong electric fields in storms. But to medieval people, oh, this wasn't plasma. This was a cosmic announcement, a divine mood swing, a supernatural, guess what, you're not sleeping tonight. When the blue flames appeared on ship masts, sailors reacted with the enthusiasm of people who believed they were being visited by glowing angels. Half the crew dropped to their knees, the other half cried, and the captain pretended he knew what was happening, even though he absolutely did not. On land, peasants responded creatively. The church steeple lights up. Demons have arrived. The barn roof glows blue. Witches. Definitely witches. Your hair starts crackling and glowing. That's it. I'm dead. Some brave souls reached out to touch it, because medieval people had the unique ability to fear everything, yet still poke glowing phenomena with sticks. Those who touched it were usually blasted backward by the static, after which the village declared them spiritually charged or slightly cursed. And priests? They loved St. Elmo's fire, not because they understood it, but because it gave them dramatic sermon material. They'd stand before the congregation saying things like, "This is a sign from heaven," while secretly hoping the blue flames wouldn't happen again during their shift. Meanwhile, travellers brought back new theories every week. It's angels. It's demons. It's sea spirits climbing onto ships. It means someone in the village offended God. Everyone immediately blamed Gerald, who always offended someone, and of course the noble class used the phenomenon for theatrical effect. If St. Elmo's fire appeared on their castle turret, they'd declare it was divine confirmation that their rule was blessed. The peasants, shivering in the fields, quietly disagreed. The truth? St. Elmo's fire was harmless, just electricity showing off during bad weather. But medieval people didn't know that. All they knew was that the world suddenly glowed blue, like it had been dipped in magic. And if you lived in a time with no science textbooks, no weather apps, and a strong belief that everything meant something, a glowing steeple wasn't just strange, it was a cosmic message, even if the message was just, "Storm's bad. Go inside." If you lived in medieval Europe and suddenly felt the urge to dance, congratulations. That was considered a medical emergency. In the dancing plague, entire towns would suddenly erupt in non-stop, uncontrollable dancing, not graceful waltzing, not cheerful folk dancing. More like, "My legs have betrayed me and I cannot stop dancing." The most famous outbreak hit Strasbourg in the 16th century, when one woman walked into the street and began dancing for no reason. People thought, she'll stop soon. She did not. Instead, other villagers joined in, proving peer pressure is stronger than common sense. Within a week, dozens were dancing. Within a month, hundreds. It was the medieval version of a flash mob, except no one planned it, no one enjoyed it, and everyone wanted it to end. Modern scientists blame mass hysteria. Medieval doctors blamed hot blood, because if you didn't understand something back then, the correct diagnosis was always either hot blood, cold blood, or the devil. Priests confidently proclaimed it was a curse and recommended praying, fasting, or, if that failed, playing music to encourage the dancers to dance out the demon. Yes, they hired musicians. Imagine being forced to dance for hours while some guy with a drum enthusiastically tries to help. Meanwhile, the dancers were exhausted, terrified and confused. Some begged for someone to hold them still. Others collapsed, only to leap back up because their legs decided this was not the time for rest. They danced through pain, hunger, dehydration, blisters, and the worst medieval problem of all, public humiliation. The town authorities eventually stepped in, not out of compassion, but because people dancing themselves into medical bankruptcy is bad for taxes. Their solution? Build a stage. Put the dancers on it. Add professional musicians. If you're thinking, there is no way they thought this would help, you are correct. But medieval logic doesn't need to make sense. It just needs to sound confident. Of course, not everyone reacted with concern. Some villagers, bored out of their minds, treated it like entertainment. What's happening today? Oh, just 40 people dancing against their will. Nice. Better than watching goats again. Eventually, the plague burned out on its own, leaving behind traumatized legs and confused locals. Was it psychological stress? Contaminated food? Social pressure? Historians still debate it. But medieval people agreed on one thing. It was the worst dance marathon in human history, and no one even won a prize. If you've ever seen a big flock of birds and thought, wow, that's a lot, then medieval people would like a word with you, because what they saw wasn't a flock. It wasn't even a swarm. It was a biblically sized sky army that turned daylight into nope. Bird migrations in medieval Europe were on a scale modern civilization barely remembers. Millions of birds, starlings, cranes, geese, you name it, would lift into the air at once, forming a massive feathered cloud that stretched across the horizon. To medieval villagers, this wasn't nature. This was a sign, a message, a celestial threat, a feathery apocalypse. Imagine you're a medieval peasant gathering turnips, minding your own business, when suddenly the sun disappears. Not behind clouds, behind wings. The sky goes dark, the air fills with screeching, and every bird in Europe seems to be doing a synchronized aerial invasion. Naturally, the villagers did the only sensible thing, panic immediately. Some dropped to their knees, convinced God was delivering a message, and a very loud one at that. Others assumed this was the end of the world, because medieval people declared the end of the world at least twice a week. A few optimistic thinkers said, maybe it's a sign of good fortune, while everyone else wondered if birds were about to start stealing children. And of course the local priest had to weigh in with confidence levels far surpassing his actual knowledge. He'd stand before the congregation and declare something bold like, "The birds are forming a heavenly army." Meanwhile, a single goose would land behind him and honk aggressively, proving at least one creature was clearly sent by Satan. The noise alone was enough to traumatize anyone. Thousands of wings flapping in unison sounded like a medieval drumline mixed with windstorms and judgment. People covered their ears and prayed. Animals panicked. Chickens ran in circles, which chickens do anyway, but still. Horses tried to flee. Even the cats, normally unbothered by the concept of chaos, looked concerned. And then there was the poop. Medieval chronicles do not mention this, but nature certainly did. When millions of birds fly overhead, they drop millions of blessings, fields, roofs, wagons, unlucky villagers. Nothing was spared. One unlucky man could go outside for 2 minutes and come back looking like he'd lost a war with oatmeal. But once the sky cleared and daylight returned, life resumed. Villagers sighed in relief. Priests pretended they'd predicted it correctly. And birds just kept migrating, completely oblivious to the existential crisis they caused. To medieval people, these sky armies were terrifying omens. To the birds, it was just Monday. If you were a medieval peasant and wanted a peaceful afternoon, maybe a quiet moment to churn butter or contemplate why everything in life hurt, the absolute worst thing that could happen was spotting a Viking longship on the horizon. Because that didn't just mean Vikings, it meant Viking berserkers, the human equivalent of an unhinged tornado wearing fur pants. A berserker wasn't your average warrior. Oh no. These were the Nordic rage machines who fought in a trance so intense that even their fellow Vikings probably thought, he needs therapy. Berserkers were famous for charging into battle without armour, without fear, and often without shirts, because nothing says, "I am ready to destroy you," like willingly freezing your nipples off in Scandinavian weather. To medieval peasants, witnessing a berserker in action was like watching a myth come to life, a very sweaty, very loud myth. These warriors would howl, shake, bite their shields, and foam at the mouth like a wolf that just discovered caffeine. Their eyes widened, their veins popped, and they sprinted into battle at full speed, sometimes faster than physics should allow. Imagine being a simple turnip farmer and seeing a giant blonde man barreling toward you, screaming like a kettle left too long on the fire. Your first thought wouldn't be strategy. Your first thought would be, I am about to become a footnote in a monk's diary. Now, to explain berserkers, modern historians enjoy using phrases like psychological warfare, battle trance, and possibly hallucinogenic mushrooms. Medieval villagers had a simpler explanation. This man is possessed by something large, angry, and definitely not house-trained. Some believed berserkers transformed into bears or wolves mid-fight. Others believed they couldn't be harmed by weapons, which was false but terrifying. Many insisted their screams were strong enough to make cattle faint. And honestly, considering how medieval cattle behaved, maybe that part was true. And then there was the shield biting. Berserkers would chew into their shields like they were auditioning for a medieval toothpaste commercial. Peasants watching this didn't think, intimidation technique? They thought, "He's eating wood. Next he'll eat us." Even other Vikings treated berserkers carefully. These were the co-workers you didn't make eye contact with. The guys who got invited to the raid, but not the after party, because nobody wanted to see them try to drink calmly. To medieval people, berserkers weren't just strange. They were living nightmares. Shirtless, roaring, adrenaline-powered nightmares. And you can bet every villager who saw one sprinting toward them thought the exact same thing. That's it. I'm moving inland. If there's one thing medieval people did not need in their already stressful lives, it was red rain falling from the sky. Regular rain was bad enough. It ruined crops, flooded roads, and turned every field into ankle-deep mud that smelled suspiciously like livestock regret. But when the rain suddenly turned red, that was when villagers collectively said, "Ah, yes, the apocalypse. Finally." Here's the scientific explanation. Desert dust storms sometimes carry iron-rich particles so high into the atmosphere that rainwater turns reddish when the particles mix with moisture. But medieval people did not have access to meteorological science. Their worldview was simpler. If something weird happened, it was either God sending a message, the devil sending a memo, or Margaret the strange neighbour messing with forbidden magic again. The first time blood rain hit a village, the reaction ranged from horrified screaming to intense horrified screaming. People ran through the streets yelling about signs, omens, plagues, and in one recorded case, "The sky is bleeding, the sky is bleeding," which, honestly, is a perfectly reasonable interpretation if you've never heard of iron dust. Crops splattered with red droplets were declared cursed. Laundry hanging outside was immediately burned. Animals covered in spots were assumed to be demon-touched. And somewhere in the chaos, a monk was always present with a quill, writing things like, "The heavens wept blood this day," which definitely helped calm absolutely no one. Priests rushed to organize emergency prayer sessions. Entire congregations stood outside in the very rain they feared, begging the heavens for mercy while getting soaked in ominous red droplets. People swore they could smell iron, which, to be fair, they could, but they interpreted it as the scent of divine disappointment. Meanwhile, practical villagers tried collecting the rain to examine it, hoping perhaps it actually was real blood. It wasn't, but medieval logic said, well, it looks like blood, and it acts like rain, so clearly it's magical. If anyone suggested a natural explanation, they were immediately told to go sit quietly, because no one wanted rational thinking during a crisis. Animals, of course, were unbothered. Sheep grazed peacefully in fields covered with red-splattered grass. Horses drank from red puddles with zero concern. Chickens stared blankly at the sky as if saying, "We've seen worse." Eventually, the storm passed. The sky stopped bleeding, and villagers returned to normal life, which, for medieval people, still involved plagues, taxes, questionable bread, and occasional Viking raids. Blood rain wasn't the end of the world. It just felt like it, which was enough for medieval people to panic for a full generation. If you think modern UFO sightings are wild, wait until you hear what medieval monks wrote down, because these men were not scrolling TikTok at 2 a.m. They were sober, celibate, overworked, and extremely bored. So when they saw something strange in the sky, they didn't shrug and say, "Weather." They grabbed a quill like it was time to document the end of everything. Medieval chronicles contain reports of fiery wheels, shields of flame, glowing ships, and floating globes drifting across the heavens. Basically, everything except the phrase, "I swear, I'm not making this up," which is implied. Picture the scene. A monastery at dusk, the monks quietly chanting, a peaceful atmosphere, and suddenly Brother Thomas bursts in screaming, "The sky is on fire, and also spinning." The monks run outside, stare up at the phenomenon, probably a meteor, halo, or atmospheric optical illusion, and immediately conclude that God is either testing them, warning them, or showing off. One monk might calmly suggest, perhaps it's a natural light in the clouds. He is immediately ignored because medieval monks didn't spend their lives copying manuscripts by hand just to accept boring explanations. These reports weren't vague either. Some monks sketched the objects with surprising detail. You'll see drawings of circular flaming shapes, swirling discs, bright arcs, even things that look suspiciously like glowing pizza crusts cruising across the sky. If one of them had drawn a classic flying saucer, historians today would never emotionally recover. The reactions varied. Some monks fell to their knees, convinced the Last Judgment was beginning, and mentally reviewing all the times they accidentally stole extra bread from the kitchen. Others grabbed writing supplies, excited for the chance to record something that wasn't the 5th page of Brother Matthew begat Brother Peter, who begat Brother Simon. And a few, the bold ones, debated theological meaning, suggesting everything from angelic warfare to God lighting up the sky for dramatic effect. Meanwhile, the peasants who witnessed the same events offered simpler explanations. It's a sign. It's doom. It's Gerald's fault again. And honestly, medieval peasants blamed Gerald for everything. Modern scientists, of course, blame meteors, auroras, ice crystals, and atmospheric reflections. Things monks had never heard of. But the monks' UFO diaries remain hilariously sincere, beautifully detailed, and extremely confused. Were they aliens? Were they weather phenomena? Were they just medieval men who desperately needed hobbies? Hard to say. But one thing is certain. When something glowed, spun, or zoomed through the medieval sky, the monks didn't just see it. They published it. If you ever find yourself lost in a medieval forest at night, first of all, congratulations, you're already doomed. You might notice something glowing faintly in the distance. Something soft, eerie, greenish. Something that looks exactly like a dead soul trapped inside a log. Modern people would say, "Oh, cool, bioluminescent fungus." Medieval villagers said, "Nope, absolutely not. That's a spirit. We are leaving." This glowing wood, known today as foxfire, is caused by fungi that produce light through a chemical reaction. But medieval people obviously didn't know this. They had two possible explanations. Ghosts. Even angrier ghosts. Imagine you're walking through the woods at night to fetch firewood. Already a terrible idea. And suddenly you see a stump glowing green, like it's about to ask you to solve a riddle. You drop everything, scream, and sprint home so fast you invent cardio centuries early. The stories spread like wildfire, ironically faster than actual medieval fire safety allowed. Peasants whispered, "The dead are haunting the forest." Others claimed the glowing logs were enchanted by fairies, which sounds cute until you remember medieval fairies were basically tiny demons with hobbies. Then church officials got involved, and things escalated. Priests warned villagers not to approach the glowing wood in case it corrupted the soul. Which is funny, because the biggest danger was tripping over a root and face-planting. Some said foxfire marked the places where evil spirits held meetings. Others believed it was where drowned souls gathered at night. And a few insisted the glow was a sign that the forest itself was alive and watching. In fairness, medieval forests were watching, through wolves, bears, and other creatures who saw humans and thought, "Snack." Despite the terror, foxfire accidentally became useful. Travellers used it as a natural lantern, though they didn't enjoy holding pieces of haunted wood. Soldiers noticed it helped illuminate camps at night, but only the brave ones used it, because no one wanted to sleep beside something glowing and whispering. Even if it wasn't whispering, villagers assumed it was. And of course, children loved it. Medieval children were unbothered by danger. They poked foxfire with sticks, carried bits home, and terrified their parents by walking into the house glowing like baby swamp monsters. Today we call it a harmless fungus. Medieval people called it a cosmic warning sign. To them, glowing wood wasn't natural. It was the forest politely saying, "Turn around, you do not belong here." Nothing frightened medieval villagers more than the idea that a person could suddenly burst into flames for no reason. Medieval life was already hard. Plagues, taxes, questionable bread quality, and Viking raids. The last thing they needed was spontaneous human combustion showing up like, "Hey, mind if I ruin your entire evening?" Reports began spreading through villages about people who supposedly just ignited. One moment they were sitting near a fire, drinking ale, or taking a nap. The next, according to rumour, they were a human torch with no warning. Villagers didn't ask for details. Why bother when fear works faster? Now, the modern explanation is simple. A dropped lamp, a spilled candle, a bit too much alcohol, and fabrics that burned like they were working with the flames. But medieval people didn't have modern explanations. They had medieval explanations, which is to say, dramatic ones. If a villager caught fire, the community didn't assume it was an accident. No. They immediately jumped to, the devil has claimed another soul. Even if the person was sitting right next to a candle. Even if the candle was on their lap. Even if everyone told them not to fall asleep near open flames. A few blamed witches, because witches were the medieval version of blame it on the weather. Someone would shout, "This is witchcraft!" and everyone would nod solemnly while ignoring every obvious danger in the room. Witnesses swore the body burned hotter and faster than normal, which makes sense when your house is made entirely of dry wood and your clothes are basically flammable blankets soaked in grease. But medieval villagers refused logic. Logic was suspicious. Logic smelled like sorcery. Monks, ever eager to document something juicy, wrote detailed accounts describing victims reduced to ashes and legs. That was the classic description. A pile of ash and two unharmed lower legs sitting politely in the middle of the room, like they'd chosen not to participate in the chaos. Of course, these written cases left out key details such as, "We keep leaving open flames near sleeping drunk people." Maybe we should stop wearing wool soaked in lamp oil. Lighting our entire house with fire is inherently risky. But medieval villagers preferred the supernatural explanation because it was more exciting, and because rethinking safety meant admitting their homes were basically matchboxes. The panic spread so widely that some villages even created rules about staying away from fire if you looked flammable, a term generously applied to anyone who drank, sneezed, or existed. Today, we understand spontaneous combustion isn't real, but to medieval people, you could ignite at any moment, and that made life thrilling in all the worst ways. If you think medieval Europe was predictable, think again, because one day in the 12th century, two children with green skin casually walked out of a wolf pit in the English village of Woolpit. Yes, a wolf pit. Because medieval England solved wolf problems by digging giant holes and waiting for wolves to fall in. This time, instead of wolves, they got whatever these kids were. The children spoke a language no one recognized, refused every kind of food except beans, and looked like they had been grown in a magical vegetable garden. Naturally, the villagers reacted the medieval way. Panic first, ask questions never. At first, they tried feeding the children bread. The kids said no. Then they tried meat. The kids said absolutely not. Vegetables? Only beans. Only beans forever. They were the world's first committed vegans, centuries before it was cool. The villagers gathered around, whispering, "Are they fairies? Are they forest spirits? Are they demons?" Meanwhile, the children were thinking, "Why does everyone here smell like damp hay?" The green skin was the biggest shock. Medieval people already believed in elves, demons, and glowing wood, so green children were basically confirmation that the universe was bored and improvising. Some thought the kids came from an underground world. Others thought they were cursed. A few simply shrugged because medieval villagers had seen so many strange things that nothing surprised them anymore. Eventually the children were taken in by a local noble, because nobles loved collecting mysterious things the way modern people collect limited edition sneakers. Under his care, the children slowly learned English, adjusted to their new world, and, as they ate less bean-only diets, their green colour faded. Which means medieval England accidentally discovered nutritional science long before anyone else. The boy, sadly, didn't survive long, leaving behind many unanswered questions and absolutely zero explanations. The girl grew up, learned the language, and gave a vague explanation. She said she and her brother came from a land called St. Martin's Land, where everything was dim and green. Was it a real place? A metaphor? A child's imagination? A translation error? Nobody knows. Historians today propose everything from malnutrition to liver disease to a real geographic community living in isolation. But medieval villagers preferred the fun version. They were from another world. Because that's the thing about the Middle Ages. When the universe dropped two mysterious children into your wolf pit, you didn't question it. You just said, "Welp, add that to the list." Imagine being a medieval villager, stepping outside for a peaceful morning, maybe hoping today will be the one day nothing strange happens. And then the sky opens up and drops a trout onto your head, or a frog, or 50 frogs, or an entire school of confused aquatic animals wondering how they ended up airborne. Welcome to Animal Rain, one of nature's rudest meteorological pranks, and one of the most bewildering things medieval people ever witnessed. Of course, today we know storms can pick up small animals from ponds or rivers, carry them miles through the air, and dump them unceremoniously on whichever unlucky town is beneath them. But medieval villagers didn't have weather maps or physics. They had vibes, and the vibes said, witches. Or, if the frogs were particularly bouncy, very upset witches. Imagine the scene. A farmer is tending his cabbages when suddenly a frog plops onto the soil beside him. He looks up just in time to see a second frog descending like a tiny green meteor. Within moments, dozens are raining down, each one landing with a wet slap that screams, "I did not sign up for this!" Villagers responded with immediate panic. People covered their heads, sprinted indoors, screamed prayers, or, in rare cases, tried to catch the falling creatures like medieval Pokemon. Some believed the animals were omens of famine or plague. Others decided the frogs were soldiers in Satan's amphibian army. At least one chronicler confidently declared fish rain to be a sign that human sin has reached the ponds. Priests rushed to the scene, robes flapping, trying to interpret what message the heavens were sending. They usually settled on something vague like repent, because medieval clergy had learned that this advice applied to approximately every situation. Meanwhile, the animals themselves were having the worst day of their lives. One moment they're swimming peacefully, the next they're being sucked into the sky and dropped miles away into a field, a roof, or, on unlucky days, a bucket of milk. No wonder medieval frogs always looked annoyed in manuscripts. Chickens chased the new arrivals. Cats investigated suspiciously. Dogs barked at the sky as if yelling at it to stop throwing stuff. But once the rain ended, medieval people did what they always did. Cleaned up, panicked a little more, blamed Margaret the strange neighbour, and wrote it down as evidence that the world was not functioning correctly. To us, animal rain is unusual but explainable. To medieval people, it was the heavens doing improv, and nature's improv had very questionable comedic timing. If you were a medieval peasant, you didn't need theatre for entertainment. You just needed to watch a fully armoured knight trying to function in the middle of a brutal heat wave. Because nothing says elite warrior class like a nobleman slowly cooking inside 30 kilograms of metal while insisting everything is perfectly fine. Picture this. It's a scorching summer day. The air is thick. The fields are steaming. Even the chickens look overheated. And then, across the horizon, you see a knight trotting along in full plate armour, a medieval sauna with a horse attached. Peasants would stop working just to stare, not out of admiration, but out of deep confusion. Because knights were basically wearing cast-iron ovens. A village blacksmith could have cooked dinner on a knight's chest plate with minimal effort, but knights refused to remove even a single piece of armour. Not because of safety. No. Because medieval nobility possessed two tragic flaws. Pride, zero understanding of heat stroke. A knight could be drenched in sweat, swaying in the saddle, breathing like a boiling kettle, and still insist, "Nay, good sir, I am perfectly comfortable." Meanwhile, the horse beneath him is rethinking its entire career. Peasants watching this suffered second-hand heat stroke. The blacksmiths, who actually understood metal, looked horrified. They whispered things like, "He's going to melt his insides," while the knight loudly proclaimed, "This armour is my honour," just before fainting dramatically into a haystack. During tournaments, it was even worse. Knights clanged around the field like overheated tin cans. Some wore padded underarmour that acted like medieval insulation. Excellent in winter, catastrophic in summer. You could practically hear the sizzling. And the worst part, they trained in it. Squires forced to assist in this medieval grilling session learned valuable lessons like how to drag a fully unconscious nobleman out of his armour, how to remove a helmet fused with sweat, how to politely ignore the smell of baked human marinating in wool. There were actual accounts of knights collapsing mid-joust because their armour reached temperatures normally reserved for pottery kilns. Some had to be carried away like fallen statues, legs sticking out of their metal casing at awkward angles. Peasants didn't understand why nobles did this. They had zero context for chivalry, knightly honour, or fashion choices that ruin your body. They just saw extremely wealthy men voluntarily suffering in ways no sane person ever would. But that was medieval nobility. If you weren't sweating out 3 litres of water inside a portable oven, were you even a knight? To peasants, watching a knight march proudly in metal during a heatwave was one of the strangest and funniest sights of the entire Middle Ages. If there's anything medieval people did not need more of, it was haunted landscapes. But the Middle Ages delivered anyway. After battles, especially the messy ones, strange glowing lights would drift above the fields at night. These eerie floating orbs, flickering in shades of blue, green or white, became known as corpse lights, or will-o'-the-wisps. Today we call it swamp gas or bioluminescent decay. Medieval people called it nope, absolutely not. That field is cursed forever. Imagine being a medieval traveller walking home after sunset. You're already nervous because everything in the Middle Ages was dangerous. Wolves, bandits, plague, Margaret, the strange neighbour. And suddenly you see a gentle glowing ball hovering over last month's battlefield. It bobs, it sways, it glows brighter. And you instantly remember that you never updated your will. The lights often appeared where the ground was soaked with water, and unfortunately, decomposing humans. Gases escaping from organic matter would occasionally ignite or reflect light, creating ghostly orbs that made even the bravest knight reconsider his life choices. Villagers witnessing these lights reacted with predictable medieval logic. Those are spirits of the dead. Those are demons. Those are fairies luring us to doom. This is definitely Gerald's fault again. No one ever said, maybe it's natural. Medieval Europe was not the place for rational thinking. Parents used corpse lights as cautionary tales. Don't go out at night, or the soul lights will drag you into the swamp. Which is ironic because the real danger was the swamp. Peasants absolutely believed the lights were trying to lure them. And to be fair, walking toward flickering lights in a foggy marsh is a terrible idea, even today. Many a medieval man lost his shoe, or his life, while trying to follow the mysterious glow that whispered, "Come closer." Monks wrote about corpse lights with dramatic flair, describing them as floating souls seeking peace. Knights claimed they were ghosts of fallen warriors guarding the battlefield. Fishermen saw them near bogs and assumed fairies were planning an ambush. Meanwhile, scientists today are like, actually, it's methane reacting with phosphenes from decomposing organic matter, which is the least magical sentence ever spoken. But to medieval villagers, corpse lights were one more reminder that nighttime belonged to things best avoided. Spirits, demons, glowing balls of doom, and the occasional fox wearing someone's lost shoe. The Middle Ages were terrifying enough in daylight, but at night, when ghostly lights drifted across abandoned fields, the world felt alive, and not in a good way. If you wandered into a medieval forest, which, to be clear, you should never do, you might end up spotting one of the strangest sights of the Middle Ages, the wild man, also known as the Woodwoes. Imagine Bigfoot, but medieval. Less mysterious, more confused. Covered in hair, armed with a club, and radiating the energy of someone who has not paid taxes ever. Wild men show up everywhere in medieval art. Towering, shaggy figures lurking at forest edges, clutching sticks, staring with an expression that perfectly says, "I wasn't expecting company." Some stories describe them as giants, others as hermits who went a little too hard on the live, close-to-nature lifestyle. Either way, they terrified villagers, because medieval forests were already nightmare zones filled with wolves, bears, bandits and plants that hated you. The last thing anyone needed was a hairy philosopher wandering around muttering to trees. Most sightings followed the same pattern. A peasant went into the woods to gather firewood. He heard rustling. He turned around, and there stood a hulking man-shaped creature covered from head to toe in hair, holding a club the size of a small child. The peasant's reaction? Immediate regret, instant prayer, maximum sprinting. Villagers told stories of wild men stealing livestock, uprooting trees, or yelling cryptic wisdom like, "The forest knows you," which is a very unhelpful sentence when you're trying to gather mushrooms. Some medieval scholars insisted wild men were magical beings, guardians of the forest, children of nature, or lost souls transformed by spiritual imbalance. Others suggested they were simply hermits who decided that bathing, haircuts, and social interaction were optional life choices. Honestly, both explanations seem equally plausible. Wild men became popular in medieval festivals too. Villages held parades where someone dressed up as a woodwoes by gluing fur onto their clothing and yelling at townsfolk. Medieval entertainment was creative. Artists loved drawing them. Muscular, overgrown men who looked like they had strong opinions about moss. They usually appeared holding clubs, being chased, or trying to kidnap maidens, because medieval storytellers absolutely could not resist adding kidnapping to everything. But the most confusing part? Many wild men were probably just regular people. Hermits, hunters, runaways from society, guys who said, "I just need some time alone," and took that idea extremely literally. To medieval villagers, the wild man symbolized the line between civilization and wilderness, and how easily a man could cross it if he skipped one too many bath days. He was terrifying, yes, but also a reminder that life in the Middle Ages was only one bad haircut away from chaos. For medieval villagers, seeing their own reflection clearly for the first time was not a gentle, whimsical experience. It was a psychological jump scare. Mirrors, or rather, polished metal plates pretending to be mirrors, slowly began improving during the Middle Ages, and the reactions ranged from fascinated to absolutely horrified. Before this, most people only caught blurry glimpses of themselves in puddles, lakes, or whatever shiny object happened to be nearby. These reflections were vague at best, more like seeing your soul through a foggy potato. So when polished metal suddenly started showing actual human faces, medieval villagers weren't prepared. Imagine being a medieval farmer who hasn't seen a clear reflection in 30 years. A merchant hands you a polished metal disc. You look into it, and immediately ask, "Who is this stranger living inside the plate?" Some thought their soul was trapped inside the metal. Others thought the object itself was alive. A few believed demons lived in mirrors, quietly mocking everyone's haircuts. And honestly, considering medieval haircuts, that theory might hold up. To make matters worse, early mirrors didn't show perfect reflections. They warped faces just enough to cause panic. A villager might look into a mirror and see one eyebrow higher than the other, or a head shape slightly askew, and immediately conclude they were cursed, possessed, or having a very bad day. Then there were the vain nobles, the only people who could actually afford early mirrors. These were the trendsetters of medieval narcissism. They'd gaze at their reflections for hours, adjusting their feathered hats, stroking their unfortunate moustaches, and loudly proclaiming, "My beauty is a divine blessing." Meanwhile, peasants looked on thinking, "Sir, you look like a damp turkey." But mirrors also sparked deep philosophical debates. Monks wrote treatises about the morality of looking at oneself. Priests warned that vanity was sinful, and some scholars genuinely wondered if a mirror could steal your essence. Spoiler, it cannot, not even on Mondays. Children, as usual, were the most fearless. They immediately began sticking their tongues out at their reflections, waving at themselves, or asking if the mirror person lived in another world. Medieval parents panicked. Children did not. And of course, there was always one villager who saw himself clearly for the first time and said, "Ah, so this is why Margaret won't marry me." The arrival of the mirror didn't just let people see their faces. It let them see their flaws, their expressions, their humanity, and occasionally their disappointment. To us, mirrors are ordinary. To medieval people, they were portals, mysteries, soul traps, or the world's earliest selfie technology. And that's the beauty of the Middle Ages. Even something as simple as seeing your own reflection was considered strange. Rome was impressive from a distance, its temples gleaming in the sun, its aqueducts stretching across the landscape like the bones of giants, its reputation echoing across the Mediterranean. But up close, at street level, Rome was a creature of noise, tension, and barely controlled chaos. The city packed more than 1 million people into a maze of cramped alleyways, decaying tenements, and open-air markets where fresh produce sat beside piles of refuse. At any moment, a simple shove, a drunken insult, or a political grudge could turn a street corner into a battleground. This was the Rome most citizens actually lived in, a city where fear was as common as bread. The police force, in the modern sense, did not exist. The urban cohorts would not appear until the reign of Augustus, and even then, they were more military than peacekeepers. In the late Republic, enforcement depended on whoever had money, muscle, or influence. Senators hired their own guards. Wealthy households kept private enforcers. Ordinary people walked fast, kept their heads down, and hoped not to get caught between rival groups. If you lived in Rome at night, you carried a lamp, a knife, or a prayer, sometimes all three. The atmosphere of insecurity was perfect breeding ground for gangs. Young men without work, freedmen seeking quick profit, political hopefuls hungry for power, all found opportunity in Rome's shadows. Tension simmered constantly. A procession could turn into a riot. A funeral could become an act of intimidation. A political meeting might end with clubs and stones rather than votes. Even everyday errands carried an edge. A trip to the baths, the tavern, or the public latrine meant brushing shoulders with gamblers, thieves, hired thugs, and the desperate. The government knew this, of course, but the ruling elite also knew that violence could be useful. For ambitious politicians, street muscle was cheaper than soldiers, more loyal than voters, and far easier to deploy. A hired gang didn't argue about legal technicalities. They simply showed up, shouted loud, swung harder, and disappeared into the crowds of Subura or Aventine before anyone could identify them. This was Rome's truth. Beneath the marble, the forums, and the rhetoric of the Senate, real power often rested in who controlled the streets. And by the last decades of the Republic, those streets were slipping into the hands of men who understood one thing very well. Fear was a currency, and in Rome it paid extremely well. Before the gangs became instruments of political terror, the collegia were ordinary associations, trade groups, neighbourhood clubs, funeral societies, and social circles for craftsmen, merchants, and freedmen. At their best, they were Rome's version of community support networks, places where men pooled funds for funerals, organised feasts, worshipped local gods, and protected their shared interests. But in a city as explosive as Rome, nothing stayed innocent for long. By the late Republic, many collegia had drifted far from their original purpose and began transforming into disciplined, loyal, and often violent factions. These groups already had structure, leaders, treasuries, meeting halls, and members accustomed to acting together. So when powerful politicians looked for ready-made street armies, the collegia became an obvious resource. A local carpenters' guild, with a few subtle payments and promises, could quickly evolve into a unit of club-carrying supporters ready to shout down rivals, intimidate voters, or break up an opponent's assembly. And once money started flowing, loyalty hardened into something far more aggressive. Rome's neighborhoods, especially the crowded Suburra, became divided by factional lines. A collegium tied to a senator or tribune often patrolled streets, protecting local voters, while making very clear which side they should remain loyal to. Outsiders, especially supporters of rival factions, were harassed or beaten. By night, some collegia acted like organized crime rings, collecting payments, settling disputes with fists or blades, and controlling taverns, gambling dens, and local markets. A seemingly harmless association of bakers or tanners might, in practice, be a neighborhood militia. The Senate occasionally attempted to ban these collegia, recognizing the danger, but Rome was too vast and too chaotic for such laws to work. Disbanded groups went underground. Outlawed meetings simply relocated to private homes, bathhouses, or taverns. And politicians, those who benefited most, quietly ensured that enforcement was flexible when convenient. The turning point came when ambitious leaders realized they could use collegia not merely to influence local districts, but to dominate citywide politics. A coordinated group could disrupt elections, escort candidates, chase rivals from the forum, and show strength during public gatherings. The collegia had drifted far from their roots. They were no longer social clubs. They were proto-gangs, organized, equipped, and loyal to whoever funded them. Rome's streets now belonged to whoever commanded the most bodies, the loudest chants, and the heaviest clubs. And into this volatile world stepped a man who would turn the collegia into something far more dangerous. Publius Clodius Pulcher was not the first Roman politician to use thugs, but he was the first to turn street violence into a political art form. Born into a patrician family, but hungry for the adoration of the masses, Clodius rebranded himself as a champion of the common people. He lowered the price of grain, attacked aristocratic rivals, and made sure his name echoed through every alley of the Suburra. But his true genius, and his true danger, came from how effectively he weaponized the collegia. Once he became tribune of the plebs in 58 BCE, he legalized the collegia that the Senate had previously banned. But this restoration was no act of charity. Clodius knew exactly what he was doing. He was converting neighborhood associations into a loyal army. Under his patronage, these collegia expanded rapidly. Their leaders were elevated to positions of prestige, their members paid generously, and their loyalty rewarded with influence. Within months, Clodius commanded the single most powerful gang network Rome had ever seen. With this new force behind him, he dominated Rome's public spaces. His followers escorted him like a monarch, chanting his name, carrying clubs, and clearing crowds. Elections became spectacles of intimidation. Rival speakers at the forum found themselves drowned out or chased off by roars of violence. Senators who opposed him avoided public appearances entirely, fearing ambushes. Even Cicero, one of Rome's sharpest tongues, fled the city when Clodius targeted him. His house burned, his property seized, his allies threatened. Clodius's gang wasn't just large, it was organized. Members trained together, marched in formation, and followed orders closely. They controlled key districts, watched important intersections, and monitored political gatherings. On feast days or public festivals they appeared in force, showing the city and the Senate that Clodius held real power, the kind measured not in laws, but in fists. But Clodius's rise came with equal and opposite force. His boldness alarmed rivals, especially those who still believed the Republic should be governed from the Senate chamber, not the streets. And in time, one man would step forward to challenge him directly, matching gang for gang, blow for blow. For now, though, Rome was Clodius's arena. His voice echoed through its streets. His men ruled its neighborhoods. And his brand of politics marked a turning point, the moment when street violence stopped being a tool of politics and became its driving engine. If Clodius was the charismatic populist who turned Rome's streets into a personal stage, then Titus Annius Milo was the blunt force hammer sent to smash that stage apart. Milo was everything Clodius was not: aristocratic in attitude, openly aggressive, and utterly uninterested in winning the love of the masses. He didn't charm crowds, he intimidated them, and when the Senate and conservative elites realized Clodius had built a monster they could not control, they found in Milo the perfect weapon. Milo rose to prominence under the patronage of Pompey the Great. With Pompey's backing and senatorial funds, Milo recruited his own gangs, just as organized, just as violent, and far more disciplined. His men were often gladiators, bodyguards, and veterans from private armies, men comfortable with bruised knuckles, broken noses, and the idea that the law existed only for people too weak to ignore it. If Clodius's collegia were street mobs, Milo's men were street soldiers. The clash was inevitable. Every Roman knew it. Markets, taverns, bathhouses, even the Forum itself, buzzed with anticipation. When Clodius's men marched toward a political assembly, Milo's appeared on the opposite side, ready to contest the ground. If Clodius tried to host a speech, Milo's gang waited nearby, turning debates into brawls. Clubs, stones, slings, and fists became the language of politics. Citizens often stayed home on election days, knowing full well that the ballot box belonged not to voters, but to whichever gang arrived first. The rivalry escalated with shocking speed. Ambushes replaced arguments. Rumour spread that both men tracked each other's movements obsessively, dispatching scouts across Rome to report sightings. A normal walk across the city became a tactical manoeuvre. Even priests and public officials tread carefully. Temples, marketplaces, and public festivals were no longer safe. What made Milo truly dangerous was his confidence. While Clodius cultivated image and popularity, Milo embraced the raw force of intimidation. He would appear openly armed, patrolling Rome's main streets with bands of gladiators in tow. Crowds parted not out of admiration, but out of survival instinct. For the first time, Clodius faced an opponent who did not fear him, could not be bullied, and would not back down. Rome had become a chessboard with two kings, each moving gangs like pieces, each waiting for the decisive, catastrophic collision. And everyone sensed that when Clodius and Milo finally met without restraint, the result would shake the Republic to its core. By the late 50s BCE, Rome no longer felt like a capital of laws and order. It felt like a siege zone. Ordinary people learned to read the city like a battlefield map. The Subura belonged to Clodius. The Palatine slopes and the route to the Forum leaned toward Milo. The Forum itself, supposed to be the sacred heart of Roman civic life, was a place where no one lingered unless absolutely necessary. To cross the city was to gamble with fate. The wrong street at the wrong hour could drop a citizen straight into a street battle wearing sandals instead of armour. The escalation happened gradually, then all at once. It began with chants, insults, and fistfights. But when fists no longer decided outcomes, the gangs escalated. Clubs became standardized. Sling bullets appeared. Some thugs carried daggers hidden beneath tunics. Gladiators, men trained to kill for entertainment, became prized assets. To the Senate's horror, Rome's sacred processions and religious festivals transformed into invitations for violence. A funeral could trigger a riot. A public speech could end in a stampede. Temples were no longer sanctuaries. Even priests hesitated to intervene when gangs clashed outside sacred steps. Clodius perfected the art of overwhelming noise and spectacle. When he marched through Rome, his mobs filled entire streets, chanting his name, waving torches, blocking traffic, and intimidating anyone who dared oppose him. Milo responded not with spectacle, but with calculated strikes. His men moved in smaller, sharper units, gladiator squads ready to break crowds apart with brutal efficiency. When the two groups collided, the violence was immediate and devastating. People died. Many more were maimed. And still, neither side relented. The government was effectively paralyzed. Senators tried to hold meetings only to find the Curia surrounded by armed gangs. Votes were impossible. debate was drowned out by shouting mobs. Some senators arrived flanked by their own hired guards, while others simply stayed home, declaring illness rather than risk their lives. Rome, the proud republic, had become hostage to two men and their street armies. The people learned to watch the sky for smoke. Another tavern burned, another brawl spiraled out of control, another district taken over for the night. Rome was no longer ruled by the Senate or by tradition. It was ruled by momentum and fear. And every citizen sensed the same chilling truth. This could not continue forever. Something, or someone, would eventually break. The showdown everyone feared finally arrived on a cold January day in 52 BCE. It began not with a planned ambush, but with a coincidence, or so the stories claim. Clodius was travelling along the Appian Way, returning to Rome after visiting one of his estates. Milo, coincidentally, was also en route, accompanied by his usual retinue of heavily armed gladiators. In any other era, the two men passing on a road would have been an inconvenience. But in Rome's climate of political gang warfare, it was a spark thrown into a powder keg. Accounts differ, depending on whose side the storyteller favoured. Some say Clodius's men initiated the brawl. Others claim Milo's gladiators provoked the attack. What is certain is that insults were exchanged, weapons were drawn, and chaos erupted. Travellers fled, mules bolted, servants dove into ditches. The road that led countless armies toward glory now witnessed a street fight worthy of a Colosseum sandpit. Clodius was wounded early in the melee. Realizing the danger, he fled into a nearby inn. But Milo's men pursued, determined to end the rivalry once and for all. They dragged Clodius out, bleeding and unable to defend himself. Then, on the stones of the Appian Way, far from the Senate he terrorized and the crowds that adored him, Publius Clodius Pulcher was cut down. In minutes, the most feared street boss in Rome lay dead. But death did not end the chaos. It ignited it. Word of Clodius's murder spread like wildfire. Streets filled with outraged supporters. His corpse, carried back to Rome, became a rallying symbol. Crowds gathered in the Forum, screaming for vengeance, hurling stones, and blaming the Senate for the killing. The funeral took on the atmosphere of a riot. As emotions surged, Clodius's followers used his pyre to torch the Senate house itself. Flames engulfed the Curia Hostilia, consuming centuries of political history in one enormous, furious blaze. Rome's streets, already unstable, now felt on the brink of civil collapse. Milo attempted to defend himself legally, but with Clodius's supporters raging and the Senate terrified, the city was past reason. The gangs had reached their breaking point. Order had completely evaporated. Rome felt leaderless, lawless, and dangerously close to tearing itself apart. Something had to change, and quickly. Clodius's death did not quiet Rome, it detonated it. For years the city had lived under the constant tremor of gang rivalry, but with Clodius gone, that tension snapped violently. It felt as if an entire population exhaled in rage. His supporters flooded the streets, grieving, furious, and desperate for revenge. What had once been political rivalry now morphed into something feral, an instinctive howl from the lower classes who saw in Clodius their protector, flawed, brutal, but theirs. The Forum became an arena of hysteria. Mobs stormed the Curia Hostilia, the very heart of Rome's political life, and set it ablaze using Clodius's funeral pyre. Flames shot into the winter air, devouring roof beams, statues, centuries of documents, and the symbolic dignity of the Republic itself. The Senate watched helplessly as their meeting house, more sacred than many temples, collapsed into glowing ruin. The message was unmistakable. Street power ruled Rome, not senators in white togas. The violence did not stop there. Patrols of Clodian loyalists roamed the city, attacking anyone suspected of supporting Milo. Vendors shut their stalls, taverns boarded windows, and families locked themselves in their insulae, praying the fighting would pass them by. Rome's night sky glowed orange from scattered fires. Screams echoed through streets, where the only law was whichever gang arrived first with torches and clubs. The Senate, ordinarily paralyzed by argument, now found itself paralyzed by terror. Many senators fled to the countryside. Others barricaded themselves in their villas. A few attempted to meet, only to disperse when mobs gathered outside. Rome, the Republic's proud capital, functioned less like a city and more like a hostage situation. Every decision was stalled, every proposal drowned in fear. To make matters worse, the consuls of the year offered little leadership. With one already dead and the other utterly overwhelmed, power had effectively evaporated. Elections could not be held. Assemblies were impossible. Even basic functions, grain distribution, justice hearings, public maintenance, halted. Rome teetered on the edge of collapse, and everyone knew it. Amid this chaos, one frightening idea began circulating among senators. The Republic needed a strong hand, someone with soldiers, authority, and enough presence to walk into the forum without being swallowed by mobs. The Senate did not speak the name aloud at first, but everyone knew who they meant. Pompey. The same Pompey who had once dominated 3 continents. The same Pompey who had backed Milo. And the same Pompey who now waited, watching Rome burn. Rome had reached the point where even senators, men who loved debate more than breathing, agreed on one thing. The chaos had to end. And so they turned to Pompey the Great, granting him extraordinary powers to restore order. It was a move soaked in irony. The Republic, terrified of one-man rule, now begged for it. Pompey, cautious but calculating, accepted. And with his new authority came the reshaping of Rome's security forces, most famously the rise of the Praetorian Guard. Originally, Praetorians referred to elite soldiers who protected generals in the field, but Pompey transformed them into something else entirely, a permanent, powerful, urban force stationed in and around Rome. Their job was clear: end the gang violence, restore stability, and make the streets safe enough for senators to venture out again without being clubbed into political agreement. For ordinary Romans, their arrival felt like a thunderclap. These were not thugs with clubs or gladiators with swagger. Praetorians wore polished armor, marched in formation, and carried real military discipline. When they patrolled, the sound of their boots echoed like a warning. The days of unchecked street violence were over. Gangs that once strutted through taverns and marketplaces now scattered at the first sight of a Praetorian helmet. Their presence alone shifted the balance of power. Milo's men, suddenly hunted, could not roam freely. They were confronted, dispersed, arrested, or forced back into hiding. Clodius's remaining loyalists fared no better. Without their leader, and facing a professional military force, they collapsed almost instantly. Areas like the Subura, once noisy hubs of factional control, were swept clean with ruthless efficiency. Still, order did not return gently. The Praetorians were soldiers, not police. They enforced Pompey's will with uncompromising force. Raids became common. Streets were searched, taverns emptied, suspects detained without ceremony. Citizens, though relieved, also felt uneasy. Rome had traded mob rule for militarized authority, but in the immediate aftermath of Clodius's murder, the city needed that iron fist. The fires died down. Elections, under heavy guard, were finally held. And Milo, the other warlord of the streets, was exiled, his gangs scattered like dust. Rome breathed again, though shakily, as if recovering from a long fever. The Praetorians had restored order, yes, but they also showed Rome something dangerous: how easily power could flow from the Senate to a single man backed by soldiers. The Republic had survived the gang wars, but it had taken a step toward a new kind of rule. With the Praetorians enforcing order and Milo exiled, Rome finally experienced a fragile calm. But beneath that quiet lay a deeper transformation, one that would reshape the entire Roman world. The gang wars had shown something the Republic never wanted to admit. The Senate could not protect its own capital. Not from mobs, not from warlords. not even from itself. Once the people saw soldiers on the streets restoring order, it became difficult to imagine Rome functioning without them. Pompey, for a brief moment, became the city's guardian. His authority was nearly absolute, and the Senate, once proud, argumentative, and fiercely independent, now relied on him like a frightened patient clinging to a doctor. But Pompey's power came at a cost. It set a precedent. If one man with troops could save Rome from chaos, why not let one man rule permanently? Why bother with elections, laws, and centuries of tradition when order came from military discipline, not political debate? The Praetorians, meanwhile, remained. Their presence changed daily life. They monitored crowds, guarded officials, and became a permanent feature of Rome's political machinery. And as decades passed, their influence grew. Augustus, observing the failures of the late Republic, realized street violence had taught Romans an uncomfortable truth. Stability required a central figure. So he kept the Praetorian Guard, expanded it, formalized it, and placed it directly under his control. Augustus succeeded where Milo and Clodius failed. He monopolized force legitimately. Ironically, the very gangs that once terrorized Rome helped shape the foundations of the empire. Their street wars revealed the weakness of decentralized power, proving that a republic dependent on private muscle could not survive. By the time emperors ruled, Rome no longer tolerated independent gangs marching through neighborhoods. Only one gang was allowed to wield force, the emperors. But the cost of that security was enormous. The Praetorian Guard eventually became kingmakers, assassins, and manipulators, interfering in imperial succession and selling emperorship to the highest bidder. The Republic had feared mob rule, yet in trying to avoid it, Rome embraced military rule instead. Looking back, the days of Clodius and Milo seem like a chaotic sideshow, but they were far more than that. They were the breaking point, the moment the Republic realized it needed something stronger than itself to survive. Rome survived the gangs, but it did not survive the cure. In 1860, the United States was a country tearing itself in two directions at once. The East was crowded with cities, industry, and politics that seemed to change by the hour. The West, still raw and half-tamed, stretched endlessly beyond the Missouri River, scattered with mining camps, Mormon settlements, lonely forts, and a growing population demanding connection to the rest of the country. But there was a problem, an enormous one. Communication between these two worlds was painfully slow. A letter from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California could take weeks, sometimes months, depending on weather, attacks, broken wagons, or simply bad luck. And as the nation edged closer to civil war, slow news wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. The country desperately needed speed. Not someday, not eventually. Now. And that urgency created a window for one of the most daring, reckless, and short-lived enterprises in American history. Three businessmen, William Russell, Alexander Majors, and William Waddell, looked at the map, the chaos, and the anxiety of a nation and came to a stunning conclusion. If the government couldn't deliver messages fast enough, private riders on fast horses would. No committees, no bureaucracy, no waiting. Just grit, muscle, and horsepower. Their plan sounded insane. Riders would cross 1,800 miles of frontier, desert, mountain, and snow in a relay of sprints. Stations would be built every 10 to 15 miles. Horses would be swapped in minutes. Riders would push through storms, through the freezing Sierra Nevada, through open plains where a man could see death coming from miles away. The goal? To deliver mail from Missouri to California in just 10 days. It was not just a business idea, it was a gamble with high stakes. The route cut through territories contested by native nations, through regions famous for bandits, and through landscapes that killed men who travelled slower, safer routes. But urgency reshapes what seems reasonable. And in a nation hungry for faster communication, the Pony Express caught the imagination of the public before the first horse even left the station. People sensed something new was coming. something that fused adventure with national necessity. For the first time, ordinary citizens would know within days, not months, whether the Union was holding, breaking, or drifting toward conflict. The Pony Express promised connection at breakneck speed, and America was ready to believe in it. The stage was set. All that remained was to find riders crazy enough to take the job. The Pony Express was not just a bold idea. It was a logistical nightmare built at record speed. Russell, Majors, and Waddell had barely 2 months to turn a paper dream into a functioning transcontinental lifeline. 2 months to carve an 1,800-mile route across some of the most unforgiving terrain in North America. 2 months to recruit riders, hire station keepers, purchase nearly 500 horses, and construct more than 150 relay stations stretching from Missouri to California. It was as if someone had proposed building a railroad overnight, only with wood shacks, hay bales, and raw courage. Every relay station had a purpose. Some were little more than rough cabins where a fresh horse waited, saddled and stamping. Others were home stations, where riders could eat, rest, and occasionally sleep, though most didn't linger long. These stations formed the backbone of the operation, spaced every 10 to 15 miles, so a rider could sprint at full speed without exhausting his mount. The timing was precise, almost surgical. A delay of even a few minutes per station could snowball into hours lost over the entire route. The route itself sliced through a landscape that shifted brutally from one environment to the next. Riders left the settled farms of Missouri, pushed across the wide Nebraska plains, climbed into the harsh deserts of Wyoming and Utah, and finally battled the deadly climb of the Sierra Nevada before descending into California's gold-rich valleys. Each leg demanded different skills, different nerves, and a rider who could endure freezing winds one day and blistering heat the next. To build this trail, Russell, Majors, and Waddell hired blacksmiths, carpenters, wranglers, and tough frontiermen who knew how to survive where maps became useless. Supplies had to be hauled into the middle of nowhere. Lumber, tools, nails, oats, saddles, rifles, powder, and the station keepers who would live in isolation for months. Some stations were hammered together under threat of attack. Others stood so remote that the nearest neighbour was 50 miles away. Yet somehow, against all logic, the system came together. By early April 1860, the line of stations was complete. Horses were in place, mailbags were ready, riders stood waiting, revolvers at their hips, geared for a job that promised exhaustion, danger, and a kind of fame few men would ever earn. A relay network, unlike anything else on Earth, was finally ready to roar into motion. The Pony Express needed a very specific kind of man, not a soldier, not a cowboy, not a gentleman, but a creature made from nerves of steel and a willingness to ride straight into danger without hesitation. The recruitment ads said it plainly. Young, skinny, wiry fellows not over 18, must be expert riders, willing to risk death daily. Orphans preferred. It sounded like a joke. It wasn't. Every word matched the reality of the job. Most applicants were teenagers, 15, 16, 17 years old, boys with fast reflexes, light bodies, and an eagerness that bordered on recklessness. They were paid well for the time, about $100 a month, more than many grown men earned working farms or frontiers. But the pay wasn't what drew them. It was the thrill, the danger, the pride of carrying news faster than anyone else in America. They weren't just riders, they were symbols of speed in a country desperate for it. Training was minimal. If you could ride a horse at full sprint, mount and dismount without losing momentum, fire a revolver from the saddle, and stomach the idea of crossing hostile territory alone, you were ready. There was no uniform. Riders wore whatever made sense: buckskin jackets, soft moccasins, felt hats pulled low, gloves to fight cold winds, and a revolver strapped at the waist. Some carried rifles, but many chose speed over firepower. A gun slowed you down. Hesitation could kill you. The most important piece of equipment was the mochila, a specially designed leather mail cover that draped over the saddle with 4 locked pockets. It could be lifted off and swapped onto a fresh horse in seconds. Riders treated it like sacred cargo. Losing your life was unfortunate. Losing the mail was unforgivable. Once accepted, riders learned the reality of the job. They would ride roughly 75 to 100 miles per shift, changing horses every 10 to 15 miles with no escort and no backup. They rode through territory controlled by tribes angry over expanding settlement, through storm-blasted deserts, past outlaw hideouts, and across mountains where snow could bury a man alive. If a rider fell, there was no rescue. If a horse broke down, the rider ran on foot until he found the next relay station. And yet, hundreds of young men stepped forward, eager to carve their names into the legend that was forming. The line was built, the riders chosen, and America waited for the first dash into the unknown. On April 3rd, 1860, the Pony Express thundered into history. In St. Joseph, Missouri, a crowd gathered outside the stables long before dawn. Men in hats craned their necks, women lifted their children, and reporters jockeyed for position. They weren't just watching a mail service begin. They were witnessing a national experiment, a dare flung at the vastness of the American frontier. And at 7:15 p.m., the first rider mounted a powerful bay mare, swung the mochila into place, and exploded westward like a bullet from a rifle. The crowd roared, hooves pounded against cobblestone streets. Sparks flew. And in seconds, the rider vanished into the darkening edge of the frontier, carrying congressional speeches, business letters, newspapers, and the hopes of a nation desperate for faster communication. From that moment on, the Pony Express operated like a living organism, fast, focused, relentless. Each rider sprinted to the next station, swapped horses in under 2 minutes, and bolted forward again. The mail moved through the night without pause. Riders pushed into the Nebraska plains, where endless grass unfolded like an ocean. Coyotes howled from the distance, and the stars above were so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Every hoofbeat was a reminder. Speed mattered more than comfort, more than safety, more than anything. By the time the mochila reached Wyoming, the system was working smoothly. Riders flew across open country at breakneck speeds, shifting from freezing winds to scorching daytime heat. Station keepers lit lanterns and waited through the darkness, listening for the distant drumming that meant the next sprint was seconds away. As each rider arrived, breathless and dust-covered, he shouted one word, "Mail!" and the station erupted into motion. Utah brought a different kind of challenge. Mountain passes narrowed into treacherous trails, and weather shifted with little warning. Snow could fall thick as wool even in spring. Riders pushed through the Mormon settlements, where Brigham Young himself had offered support, recognizing the value of rapid communication for a region so often isolated. And then came the Sierra Nevada, the true test. The mountains rose like jagged teeth, hiding blizzards, avalanches, and sheer drops. But the riders didn't turn back. They leaned into the wind, whipped their exhausted horses, and pressed through snow so deep it swallowed hooves. Mail that started in Missouri days earlier now crossed into California, defying everything nature threw at it. 10 days after leaving St. Joseph, the mochila arrived in Sacramento. The impossible had become real. Once the Pony Express settled into routine, routine quickly proved to be the wrong word. There was nothing ordinary about the life of a rider. Every shift was a gamble with the frontier. Riders sprinted across a landscape that seemed determined to swallow them whole. One moment, the plains stretched open and harmless. The next, a thunderstorm rolled in so violently it erased the horizon in minutes. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating riders hunched low over their horses, pushing forward through sheets of rain that felt like gravel. The wind could be just as cruel. On the high plains of Wyoming, gusts slammed into riders hard enough to knock hats clean off and even push horses sideways. Dust storms turned the world into a spinning brown wall. In winter, temperatures plunged far below freezing. Riders stuffed newspapers into their coats for insulation, wrapped hands in wool rags, and prayed their horses didn't stumble on hidden ice. Many arrived at stations with fingers numb, joints locked, and faces burned raw by wind and cold. But weather wasn't the only threat. The trail cut through territory where tensions with native tribes were high, especially during the 1860 conflict with the Paiute people. Stations were raided, horses stolen, and riders sometimes vanished, their fate guessed but never confirmed. In some stretches, riders were instructed to ride at night without lanterns, relying on moonlight and instinct to avoid becoming targets. It made the route even more treacherous, but slowing down was not an option. The mail had to move. Outlaws posed their own dangers. Some riders carried revolvers and small rifles, but most relied on speed over firepower. The rule was simple: don't fight what you can outrun. A fast horse was worth more than a good aim. Yet even the swiftest mounts couldn't prevent ambushes entirely. Riders reported arrows lodged in saddles, bullet holes in their jackets, and narrow escapes from men who saw the mochila as a payday worth killing for. Fatigue was constant. Riders sometimes nodded off in the saddle after 70 or 80 grueling miles, only to jerk awake as their horse veered toward a ditch. Meals were whatever could be eaten fast: cold biscuits, jerky, and bitter coffee swallowed between breathless sprints. Sleep came in short, dreamless fragments. Still, the riders pressed on, because the country depended on them, because the pay was good, and because the legend growing around the Pony Express was too intoxicating to abandon. The Pony Express produced legends almost immediately. Its riders were so young, so daring, and so determined that stories about them spread faster than the letters they carried. Some tales grew with retelling, but many were true. Astonishing feats of endurance that no modern courier or soldier could match. These young men weren't just employees. They became symbols of the unstoppable American frontier spirit. One of the most famous was William "Buffalo Bill" Cody, who later turned his riding experience into global entertainment. But long before the Wild West shows, Cody was a fearless teenager, hired as one of the Express's relief riders. He covered nearly 300 miles in a single continuous run after the next rider was killed during the Paiute War. With barely any rest and no regard for his own safety, Cody completed the route, proving just how far a rider could push himself when duty demanded it. But Cody wasn't alone. Robert "Pony Bob" Haslam performed what is often considered the greatest ride in the service's history. When a violent uprising cut off relay stations across Nevada, Pony Bob took the mochila from Friday Station to Buckland Station, 120 miles out, 120 miles back, through hostile territory. He survived ambushes, rode with arrows lodged in his gear, and finished the round trip despite being exhausted, wounded, and nearly frozen. His ride became an instant legend, repeated in newspapers from New York to San Francisco. Other riders made their mark in quieter but no less heroic ways. Some crossed flooded rivers by gripping their horse's mane and letting the current drag them side by side. Others galloped through blizzards so thick they lost all sense of direction, guided only by their horses' instincts. A few fought off attackers using only their revolvers and pure desperation. Many saved mailbags by hiding them under their coats, refusing to let rain, fire, or attackers destroy the letters entrusted to them. What united these riders was a simple iron rule: deliver the mail or die trying. They carried news of elections, business deals, love letters, and war updates, messages that shaped decisions thousands of miles away. To the isolated towns of the West, a rider's arrival meant connection to the rest of the world. His silhouette on the horizon could spark cheers. They were young, reckless, underpaid, and constantly exhausted. Yet for 18 extraordinary months, they captured the imagination of a nation and earned a place in American mythology. By the summer of 1860, the Pony Express was no longer just a mail route. It was a lifeline stretched thin across a frontier ready to explode. And explode it did. The Paiute War, sparked by deep grievances over land encroachment, broken treaties, and increasing violence from settlers, erupted along key sections of the express route in Nevada. Suddenly, a service already known for danger became nearly suicidal. Stations that had been lonely but peaceful outposts were now targets. Riders approaching a relay stop could find it burned to the ground, the corral empty, and the station keeper missing. Horses, the lifeblood of the express, were stolen in large numbers. In the worst cases, entire station crews were killed, leaving behind grim reminders that the frontier was no place for illusions of security. The disruptions were catastrophic. Entire stretches of the route became impassable. Riders who normally sprinted confidently into the night now faced miles of territory patrolled by warriors who moved silently and knew the land far better than any newcomer. Some riders attempted to sneak through under moonlight. Others rode at full gallop, hoping speed alone would carry them to safety. Still others turned back, knowing the risk was too great. It was during this crisis that some of the Pony Express's greatest feats were performed. Riders like Pony Bob Haslam braved arrow fire, ambushes, and burned out stations to keep the mail moving. Station keepers barricaded themselves inside crude wooden buildings, surviving on dried food and gunpowder-soaked nerves. Messages flew between California and the East Coast, carrying urgent reports about the violence, troop movements, and frontier conditions. But the cost was enormous. The company had to hire armed escorts, rebuild stations, restock stolen horses, and pay hazard wages. Money was already tight. The Pony Express had always been a financial gamble, and the war pushed that gamble toward collapse. Even so, they pressed on, determined not to let the system fail. For many riders, the Express wasn't just a job anymore. It was a matter of pride, survival, and loyalty to their fellow riders. As the conflict dragged on, the mail slowed, stations flickered on and off like unreliable lanterns, and the strain of constant danger wore down everyone involved. Still, the Pony Express endured, bloodied, battered, and astonishingly persistent. But survival came with a price. The violence exposed how fragile the entire operation truly was. And as America drifted toward a far larger conflict, the Civil War, the idea of maintaining such a costly, dangerous service began to feel unsustainable. Even as the Pony Express reached the height of its fame, another technology was quietly stretching across the American frontier. One that moved faster than any horse, never slept, and cared nothing for storms or outlaw ambushes. The telegraph, a simple wire, humming with electricity, capable of carrying a message from coast to coast in seconds. While riders risked their lives in the saddle, telegraph crews were hammering poles into frozen ground, stringing lines across mountains, deserts, and plains. With each mile of wire installed, the future crept closer, and the Pony Express unknowingly galloped toward its own extinction. To the public, the Express felt unstoppable. Newspapers printed stories of daring riders, record-breaking deliveries, and mail that crossed the continent in half the time of any previous method. But company ledgers told a harsher truth. The Pony Express was hemorrhaging money. The cost of horses, stations, repairs, and wages far exceeded profits. Even worse, the federal government, the one customer that could have saved the business, was betting heavily on the telegraph, not on sprinting teenagers with revolvers. Telegraph crews faced dangers of their own, storms that ripped down lines, mountains that resisted every tool, and attacks on construction sites during the Paiute War. But they kept building. Day after day, pole after pole, the line grew longer. When the Eastern and Western telegraph companies decided to connect their networks through Salt Lake City, the clock began ticking loudly over the Pony Express. Riders felt it in the air. Station keepers heard rumors. The wire is coming. They're only 100 miles away. Soon they won't need us anymore. Some felt relieved, an end to danger and exhaustion. Others felt betrayed, their legend cut short by cold metal and sparks. Still, the Express pushed on, determined to finish its race. Riders continued through blizzards, wars, and night terrors. Mailbags still thudded onto fresh saddles. Horses still tore across the earth with breathtaking speed. But even courage can't outrun technology. On October 24th, 1861, the transcontinental telegraph line was completed. For the first time in history, the east and west coasts were connected by instantaneous communication. The moment the first message crackled through the new line, the Pony Express became obsolete. 2 days later, the company officially shut down operations. No ceremony, no parade, just silence where hoofbeats once thundered. The era of the horse was over. The era of the wire had begun. When the Pony Express shut down in October 1861, it ended not with a dramatic final ride, but with something quieter, an understanding that its purpose had been fulfilled. The telegraph could do in seconds what riders had risked their lives to do in days. Yet for all its short existence, the Pony Express refused to fade into history. In fact, its legend only grew stronger, carried forward by the very people it once served. Former riders scattered across the frontier, some joining the Union and Confederate armies as scouts, others becoming lawmen, guides, ranchers, and explorers. A few returned home with stories that seemed unbelievable, tales of 100-mile sprints through storms, of outrunning ambushes, of crossing the Sierra Nevada with frozen hands and a burning determination not to fail. These stories travelled from saloons to newspapers, from families to frontier gatherings, each retelling polishing the myth until the Pony Express seemed larger than life. The stations, once beacons of light in an unforgiving landscape, slowly fell into ruin. Some collapsed in storms, others were swallowed by shifting sands or reclaimed by ranchers. A few were preserved, their weather-beaten timbers standing as silent reminders of an age when speed was measured not in wires and electricity, but in hooves striking earth. Even though the express lasted only 18 months, it represented something far greater than a mail service. It symbolized the courage required to bind a fractured nation. At a time when the United States teetered on the edge of civil war, these teenage riders helped keep communication alive between the coasts. Their speed gave Americans a sense of unity when unity was vanishing fast. The telegraph may have rendered the Pony Express obsolete, but it could never erase the romance of what came before it. The rider silhouetted against the setting sun, mochila slung over the saddle. The fearless sprint into darkness, trusting only a horse and instinct. The stubborn refusal to slow down, even when the world around them was swallowing lesser men whole. In many ways, the Express was the final breath of the old frontier, the last heroic gasp before technology transformed the West forever. It marked the end of a world where a single rider could hold the nation's voice under his arm and race across mountains to deliver it. Though the hoofbeats eventually stopped echoing across the plains, their legend never did. The Pony Express proved that sometimes the shortest stories burn the brightest and leave tracks no wire can ever replace. At dawn, Constantinople awakened like no other city on earth, half empire, half marketplace, and entirely alive. Before officials opened the gates of the great palace and long before the imperial court stirred from its marble chambers, the real heartbeat of the city was already thundering through its streets. Boats creaked against the docks at the Golden Horn. Fishermen shouted across the water as they hauled in the morning catch. And in the twisting alleys of the city's markets, vendors struck flint, lit their braziers, and sent the first curls of smoke swirling upward. Those curls carried the story of Constantinople. They smelled of sizzling oil, roasted nuts, tangy vinegar, grilling fish, and honey melting over hot metal pans. They smelled of the crossroads of the world, Greek herbs, Persian spices, Roman olive oil, Syrian dates, Cappadocian cheese. The city wasn't just a political capital. It was a culinary collision point where centuries of flavour traded places as easily as merchants traded coins. As the sun rose higher, the streets became a tapestry of movement. Bakers pushed wheeled ovens across uneven stones, their carts glowing red-hot as they baked sesame-covered bread rings fresh for hungry workers. Chickpea vendors shouted above the noise, scooping steaming handfuls from bronze pans and tossing them with sea salt and crushed coriander. The smell alone could stop a passerby mid-step. Closer to the harbour, sellers roasted tiny fish over open flames, their skins crackling while vinegar and garlic sizzled around them. Children ran by carrying copper cups filled with wine-soaked figs, sticky with syrup. Couriers rushing toward the imperial quarter grabbed fried dough balls, luku maids, coated in honey so fragrant it clung to their fingertips. Every district had its specialty, every alleyway its signature aroma. And it wasn't just commoners who indulged. Courtiers in silk slippers, soldiers from the barracks, monks from the nearby monasteries. Everyone mingled in these food-filled streets. Constantinople blurred social lines in a way few cities dared. A wealthy merchant might eat the same spiced chickpeas as the dock worker beside him. A noble on horseback could pause for a skewer of grilled lamb sold by a Syrian immigrant who had arrived only months before. The food stalls weren't simply places to eat. They were the empire's melting pot, a place where language, religion and class mixed together over shared meals. In Constantinople, you didn't just taste food. You tasted history, geography, and empire all at once. And as the city fully woke, its street vendors prepared for a day unlike any other, fast, loud, and bursting with flavour. If Constantinople's streets were alive at dawn, its markets roared to full power by mid-morning. Nowhere else on earth did so many cultures, ingredients, and languages collide within a single square mile. The city was the bottleneck through which the wealth of 3 continents passed, and the markets reflected that abundance in every sound and smell. The Forum of Constantine, the bustling Makros Embolos, the harbour-side stalls of the Golden Horn, and the twisting lanes of the Augustaion, all pulsed with a rhythm that felt ancient and eternal. Vendors shouted in Greek, Armenian, Latin, Arabic, and Persian, their voices merging into a chaotic symphony. Traders arrived from Cappadocia, with blocks of salted cheese wrapped in cloth. Syrians brought jars of date syrup and fragrant sesame paste. Egyptians unloaded sacks of lentils and spices so bright they looked stolen from a painter's palette. Turmeric yellow, saffron red, cumin brown. From the Black Sea came barrels of anchovies, smoked eels, and caviar sealed in wax. Every arrival added a new note to the market's endless feast. The food stalls were the true stars of this world. Lines formed in front of them as workers, monks, sailors, and visiting merchants queued for their favourite street bites. One stall specialised in honey-drenched pastries stuffed with crushed nuts. Another roasted chickpeas in great iron pans until they crackled like tiny fireworks. A Greek vendor near the city centre cooked spiced lentils until they melted on the tongue, serving them in clay bowls with a drizzle of olive oil and a squeeze of lemon. The scent changed with every step. One alley smelled of slow-cooked lamb seasoned with mint and oregano. Another carried the sharp bite of fermented fish sauce imported from the remnants of the old Roman West. A Persian merchant offered skewers of grilled meat marinated in pomegranate molasses, the glaze caramelizing beautifully over hot coals. Nearby, a Jewish baker prepared rounds of bread sprinkled with sesame and nigella seeds, soft on the inside and warm enough to steam in the cool morning air. Beyond taste, the markets offered something more powerful, a glimpse of the empire's vast diversity. Patrons dressed in everything from simple wool tunics to silks dyed imperial purple. A monk buying figs might stand beside a soldier fresh from the Anatolian frontier. A noblewoman veiled in fine linen could share a bench with a street porter carrying sacks heavier than he was. Here, food dissolved boundaries. The markets were the empire in miniature, plural, vibrant, loud, and endlessly flavourful. If Constantinople had a mascot food, something so common, so beloved, and so woven into daily life that the city wouldn't feel the same without it, it was roasted chickpeas. Known simply as Strauthia by locals, these little golden spheres fueled everyone from dock workers at the Golden Horn to monks wandering between monasteries. They were cheap, filling, and endlessly customizable, which made them the perfect street snack in a city where hunger and hurry often lived side by side. Vendors began preparing them before dawn. They soaked dried chickpeas overnight, then roasted them over large iron pans set atop glowing coals. The chickpeas rattled in the heat, popping slightly, and releasing a warm, nutty aroma that drifted through the markets and alleys. Street sellers skillfully tossed them with wooden spatulas, seasoning them with sea salt, cumin, coriander, or even crushed peppercorns imported from distant India. Sometimes they added vinegar for a tangy kick, sometimes thyme or mint for a herbal lift. No matter the recipe, the smell alone could pull customers from a block away. Chickpea vendors were everywhere. You could find them near the Hippodrome, where crowds gathered for chariot races. At the Forum of Theodosius, they clustered around fountains, where tired travellers stopped to rest. Along the city walls, soldiers on patrol bought handfuls wrapped in parchment. Children begged for them, merchants relied on them, and even courtiers grabbed a cone of roasted chickpeas when their duties forced them to skip a meal. What made chickpeas so universal was their simplicity. They didn't require elaborate equipment or expensive ingredients. Small braziers and iron pans were enough. A vendor could set up shop anywhere, under an archway, beside a tavern, or in a narrow street where the noise never stopped. The sound of chickpeas roasting, a rhythmic rattle and crackle, became part of Constantinople's soundtrack. The snack also carried a symbolic weight. Chickpeas had been eaten across the Mediterranean since ancient Greek and Roman times, but in Byzantium they became a bridge between cultures. Greek sellers seasoned them with local herbs. Syrians added spices from the east. Armenians mixed them with nuts. Persians flavoured them with tart sumac. Every vendor added a twist, reflecting the empire's incredible diversity. And because they were affordable, chickpeas blurred social lines. Rich or poor, labourer or nobleman, everyone enjoyed the same warm, salty handful, a reminder that in Constantinople, even something simple could taste like the whole world had contributed to it. If roasted chickpeas were the heartbeat of Constantinople's street food, then lukumades were its joy. Golden spheres of fried dough soaked in honey so fragrant and warm that even emperors were rumoured to sneak bites during processions. These pastries were older than the city itself, tracing their lineage back to ancient Greek cooking. But in Constantinople, they reached a level of perfection that made visitors write home about them with awe. Vendors prepared lukumades in wide bronze cauldrons filled with bubbling oil. Before the morning rush, they mixed dough from flour, yeast, and goat's milk, beating it until it turned airy and elastic. Working with practiced speed, they scooped handfuls of dough and dropped small pieces into the oil. Each piece puffed instantly, sizzling as it transformed into a crisp, hollow sphere. The surface turned golden, first pale like straw, then deep like amber. Customers waited impatiently as the vendor stirred the pastries in rapid circles to ensure even frying. But the true magic began once the lukumades left the oil. Vendors placed them on wooden boards and immediately drenched them in hot honey, infused with cinnamon, orange peel, or mountain herbs. Some sprinkled crushed walnuts on top. Others drizzled thick grape molasses for a sharper sweetness. The honey seeped into every tiny fold of the dough, creating a dessert that was soft inside, crunchy outside, and irresistibly aromatic. Lukumades attracted every kind of customer. Children saved their copper coins to buy a skewer of 3. Soldiers off duty from the barracks near the sea walls stopped for a warm handful after night patrols. Merchants bought trays for their assistants. Even monks, despite vows of modest living, were known to enjoy these treats during feast days. The pastry sellers often positioned themselves outside the great churches, where the scent of honey mingled with incense drifting from open doors. The dessert even played a symbolic role in the city's religious and cultural life. During celebrations, lukumades were handed out as tokens of goodwill. During festivals, their sizzling sound mixed with music and laughter. During winter, when cold winds whipped off the Bosphorus, a cone of steaming, honey-soaked pastries became a comfort that warmed the fingers as much as the spirit. Foreign visitors never forgot their first taste. Travellers from Persia compared them to sweet fritters back home. Italians wrote admiringly of their simplicity. Traders from the Arab world praised the honey's purity. In a city built on trade, faith, and empire, lukumades were a reminder that joy could be bought for a single coin and tasted like heaven. If Constantinople had a scent stronger than honey or roasted nuts, it was the unmistakable tang of the sea. The city breathed the Bosphorus. Every dawn, fishermen dragged nets heavy with silver-scaled treasure, anchovies, mackerel, mullet, eels, and sardines that shimmered like coins in the rising sun. and within minutes, those same fish would find their way from the water to the street markets, transforming into one of the city's most beloved and enduring street foods: salted fish. Salting fish was both art and science. Vendors worked quickly, gutting and cleaning their catch right at the harbour. They rubbed coarse sea salt into the flesh, packing fillets into wooden barrels, or laying them on woven reed mats to dry. Some fish were smoked over slow-burning fires of oak and pine, filling the air with a sharp, savoury fragrance that drifted across the docks. Others were grilled immediately, simple, fast, delicious. A splash of vinegar, a pinch of oregano, a drizzle of olive oil, and the dish was ready for anyone passing by. Harbour workers lined up for salted fish wrapped in thin bread, a makeshift sandwich that kept them full through long hours of hauling cargo. Sailors returning from weeks at sea bought skewers of grilled anchovies, still sizzling, eaten with a squeeze of lemon from Cypriot traders. Fishermen themselves, hungry from the morning catch, often ate the leftovers straight from the brazier, dipping bites into garlic-heavy sauces sold nearby. But salted fish was not only for labourers. In Constantinople, the lines between classes blurred around certain foods, and this was one of them. Aristocrats strolling near the harbours might pause to snack on smoked mackerel, prized for its richness. Monks from the coastal monasteries purchased dried fish during fasting seasons when meat was forbidden. Even imperial courtiers occasionally indulged, especially when chefs from the Great Palace recommended a particularly fresh batch. Foreigners found the variety astonishing. Traders from the Black Sea marvelled at Constantinople's anchovy obsession. Arabs compared the salty, smoky flavours to their own dried fish preparations. Italians from Amalfi wrote admiringly of the city's skill in turning such simple ingredients into unforgettable meals. Salted fish wasn't just food, it was identity. It represented the city's relationship with the sea, its reliance on trade, and its ability to turn necessity into culinary brilliance. Fresh fish spoiled quickly, but salted fish fed thousands, travelled well, and flavoured the diets of emperors and beggars alike. And in every marketplace, over every brazier, you could hear the same sound: the crackle of fish skin on hot metal, and the shouts of vendors selling the taste of the Bosphorus itself. If the scents of salted fish and roasted chickpeas defined the energy of Constantinople, then wine-soaked figs defined its soul. They were the street snack that felt like a luxury, simple, sweet, intoxicatingly fragrant, and beloved by every class from humble dockworkers to silk-robed courtiers. Figs had been treasured across the Mediterranean for centuries, but in Constantinople they reached an entirely new level of popularity, thanks to a preparation method that blended Roman heritage, Greek tradition, and Near Eastern spice. Vendors began their work at night. They simmered dried figs in large copper pots filled with watered wine, usually a cheap local red or a fragrant white from the vineyards of Bithynia. Into the pot went cinnamon sticks, shards of mastic resin, and sometimes cloves or star anise brought by traders from distant eastern ports. As the figs softened, they absorbed the wine, swelling like small golden balloons and turning glossy with syrup. By dawn, the mixture had thickened into a dark, perfumed glaze that coated each fig with irresistible sweetness. When the city awoke, vendors set their pots on braziers to keep them warm. The smell was unmistakable. Sweet fruit steeped in wine, with a whisper of spice that floated above the noise of the marketplace. People followed that scent the way bees follow flowers. A single fig, plucked dripping from the pot, cost only a small copper coin, cheap enough for labourers, tasty enough for nobles. Sailors arriving at the Golden Horn bought handfuls wrapped in vine leaves. Monks purchased bowls of figs during feast days, savouring them slowly as a rare indulgence. Young lovers shared them on quiet stone steps overlooking the Bosphorus, letting the warm syrup drip onto their fingers. Even physicians recommended them as a remedy for fatigue, digestion, and melancholy. Proof that Byzantines understood long before modern science that sweets can heal the spirit. For travellers unfamiliar with the city's culinary traditions, wine-soaked figs were a revelation. Persians compared them to their own spiced fruit preserves. Arabs recognized similarities with date syrups, yet marveled at the lighter sweetness. Latin visitors from the old western provinces called them the most comforting food in the empire. Many wrote about them in diaries, describing how the figs seemed to capture Constantinople's essence. Old, sweet, refined, and tinged with exotic flavours from half the known world. And perhaps that's why wine-soaked figs became more than street food. They became a symbol, a reminder that Constantinople was not only a city of empire and faith, but a place where simple pleasures were celebrated openly. A city where even a humble fruit could taste like history dipped in honeyed wine. What made Constantinople's street food extraordinary wasn't just its freshness, its aromas, or the sheer variety. It was the city's uncanny ability to blend the culinary worlds of three great civilizations. Greek, Persian, and Roman influences mingled here not politely, but boldly, creating dishes that could exist nowhere else. The city stood at the intersection of continents, and its food embraced that identity with open arms. The Greek backbone of the city was unmistakable. Olive oil flowed like water, drizzled over nearly everything. Herbs like oregano, thyme, and savory perfumed simple street meals. Bread, especially the beloved kalouri, covered in toasted sesame seeds, remained a staple. Lucumades, lentil stews, feta-like cheeses, and wine mixed with honey all carried echoes of ancient Greek kitchens. Even the layout of the markets, with their agoras and bustling porticos, owed much to Hellenic tradition. Yet Persian influence threaded through the cuisine like silk. Traders from the east brought spices that transformed even humble street dishes. Cinnamon, saffron, cardamom, and sumac found their way into marinades, pastries, and fruit preparations. Pomegranate molasses, dark, sweet, and tart, became a favourite for glazing grilled meats. Skewered lamb with Persian spices sizzled beside Greek fish grills. Street cooks experimented eagerly, discovering that Persian aromatics paired beautifully with the ingredients arriving from Greece and Anatolia. Then there was Rome, the older empire that still whispered through every alley of Constantinople. Romans had prized garum, the fermented fish sauce that seasoned everything from stews to vegetables, and its Byzantine descendant liquamen still flavoured soups and street broths. Roman-style sausages simmered in wine and herbs, sold hot from iron pans. Bread-making techniques from Rome blended with Greek methods, producing loaves with crispy crusts and airy centres perfect for soaking up oils and sauces. Even salted fish stalls echoed the Roman macellum, where merchants once sold their seafood wrapped in parchment. But the magic of Constantinople was not in preserving these traditions separately. It was in merging them. A fisherman might grill his catch with Greek olive oil, dust it with Persian sumac, and serve it in a Roman-style flatbread. A pastry seller could combine Greek honey, Roman nuts, and Persian spices into a single unforgettable dessert. Even a simple bowl of lentils might contain Roman vinegar, Greek garlic, and Persian cinnamon, creating a dish that belonged wholly to none of the three and yet entirely to Constantinople. Food became the empire's unofficial language. It spoke of trade, migration, diplomacy, and conflict. It showed how cultures could clash, blend, and ultimately strengthen one another. In every bite, Constantinople tasted like the world. What set Constantinople apart from every other city of its age wasn't just the variety of its foods, it was who got to enjoy them. In most ancient cities, elites and commoners ate in entirely separate worlds. But in Constantinople, the empire's beating heart, street food became the great equalizer. Everyone, from fishermen to palace bureaucrats, from barefoot porters to silk-clad nobles, walked the same markets, breathed the same intoxicating aromas, and bought the same sizzling snacks from the same braziers. The poor relied on these vendors for survival. Most lived in cramped wooden tenements where kitchens were tiny, smoky, or non-existent. Instead of cooking at home, families bought hot food from stalls, bowls of chickpeas drizzled with oil, skewers of grilled fish, warm bread rings, or handfuls of figs. For a few coppers, a child could be fed. For a little more, a labourer could fuel himself for a long shift at the docks or warehouses. But the middle class, shopkeepers, scribes, artisans, and minor officials were just as present. These were the people who filled the markets at midday, rushing between tasks. They grabbed honey pastries before returning to their workshops, enjoyed lemon-splashed anchovies while discussing politics, or bought freshly baked kuluri during afternoon errands. Their tastes shaped the market, pushing vendors to experiment, improve, and tailor recipes to regular customers. Even the upper classes embraced street food. A noblewoman visiting the great church of Hagia Sophia might stop afterward for a skewer of lamb seasoned with mint. Senate officials walking from the Augustaion to the palace complex often bought salted fish to snack on along the way. High-ranking generals, returning from meetings at the strategic command halls, were known to purchase warm bread dipped in herb oil, eating it as they rode. The emperor himself, though surrounded by palace chefs, could not escape stories of the city's more humble delicacies, many of which eventually made their way onto aristocratic banquet tables. Foreign visitors found this mingling astonishing. Arabs remarked on how nobles casually ate the same foods as fishermen. Latin merchants from Venice and Amalfi wrote admiringly of how Constantinople's markets erased social divides. Even Persian ambassadors, accustomed to court luxury, marvelled at how ordinary street dishes were crafted with care, worthy of royal kitchens. Food stalls became places where the city's classes brushed shoulders, where accents blended, where news spread faster than official proclamations. A soldier about to depart for the eastern frontier could share a bowl of lentils beside a bookkeeper from the imperial treasury. A monk could enjoy figs beside a sea captain from the Aegean. For a moment, hierarchy dissolved. In the flavours of the streets, Constantinople found unity, one bite at a time. Though centuries have passed and empires have risen and fallen, the street food of Constantinople left a legacy that still echoes across modern kitchens from Istanbul to Athens, from the Levant to the Balkans. The flavours once carried through the city's alleys on clouds of smoke and honey never disappeared. They evolved, travelled, adapted, and survived. Today they appear in familiar forms. Sesame bread rings sold on Istanbul's waterfront, honey-soaked pastries served in Greek bakeries, spiced lamb skewers grilling in Middle Eastern night markets, and dried fruits simmered in wine or syrup across the Mediterranean. But the legacy was more than recipes. It was a philosophy. Food should be shared, portable, fragrant, and unpretentious. Something enjoyed by everyone. Constantinople perfected the art of democratizing flavor. Its cooks proved that the most memorable meals didn't require palaces or lavish banquets. Only good ingredients, clever hands, and the creativity sparked when cultures meet. That spirit still thrives in modern street food culture worldwide. Constantinople's vendors also shaped how cities functioned. They made public spaces livable, turning streets into communal dining rooms and marketplaces into social hubs. Eating on the go, now a universal idea, was normal there a millennium ago. The bustle of vendors feeding labourers, monks, sailors and aristocrats created a sense of community that transcended class. Food became the city's language, its diplomacy, its daily ritual. Even in diplomacy and trade, Constantinople's food played a subtle role. Ambassadors wrote admiringly of local dishes, merchants carried recipes home, and soldiers stationed across the empire adopted flavours from the capital. When migration, war, or trade pushed people outward, they carried the tastes of the city with them. As a result, Byzantine culinary influence seeped into Italian, Balkan, Armenian, Arab and Turkish traditions, sometimes obvious, sometimes hiding in spices, techniques, or preserved foods. Archaeologists still uncover traces of this culture. Charred chickpeas in clay pots, remnants of braziers, amphorae that once carried wine for figs or oil for frying pastries. And in the old quarters of modern Istanbul, once the heart of Constantinople, you can still find vendors whose methods mirror those of their ancestors. A street seller roasting chestnuts over an iron pan, a baker sprinkling sesame on warm bread rings, a vendor ladling syrup over sweets that glisten like ancient lucumades. In these sights, you feel the city's memory. The empire may have faded, but its flavours never did. They linger in every sesame seed, every drop of honey, every grilled fish, every spiced fruit. They whisper of a city where worlds collided, where the streets smelled like history, and where a simple snack carried the taste of an empire